I'm going to take this as an opportunity today to talk about our missions, the missions of teaching and the mission of research, and how they inform one another. And something I'll also be talking about, or implied at least, is the interaction, which I just learned through my association with the pilgrimage, between intellect and emotion. And that doesn't occur when you study dry congressional election statistics. And I want to do three things today. First, an overview of the anniversary season. Second, to look at the legacies of the civil rights movement as it pertains basically to my field, political science. And then third, to review some of the voices we hear when we go out on the road. And as Rita said, we're entering the era of anniversaries. I'm going to focus on from October 1, 1962 in James Meredith through the middle of 1965 in the passage of the Voting Rights Act. A lot's left out, but keep in mind, the timeline, if you lay it out, is astounding because there's the events of the Kennedy administration, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination. There are the events of the Vietnam War, and we'll be celebrating those anniversaries. And I do want to acknowledge my wife, Debbie. Next month, she will be in Washington, D.C. reading names at the 30th anniversary of the Vietnam War. The first thing I want to talk a little bit about is I've learned the expression back in the day. And the death toll and the look at Southern justice. This was basically inspired by a list at the Southern Poverty Law Center of 40 forgotten victims of this period. And an undergraduate student at the time, Veronica Davis, and I decided to pursue this a little more. We found a list at Northeastern University, a couple of FBI lists. We compiled a list of racially inspired murders from 1950 to 1970, and we tracked them through the then legal justice system of the time. This just shows you over time the number of racially motivated murders over the period from 1950 to 1970. And out of this, Veronica wrote a distinction thesis, presented it at a conference, and I don't know whether it was the experience of working with numbers or the content here, but she's now received a graduate scholarship at the Perkins School of Theology. Now, when we looked at essentially what happened in the wake of these murders, we come up with this. Okay, 64% nothing happened after the murder. Okay. If you go here, investigation, no arrest, 75% of the cases never got to a grand jury. Track it down, 6 out of 122 incidents wound up with a jury trial, a conviction, and imposing a reasonable sentence instead of light or probation. Two key variables here to help us understand which cases at least got looked at. Number one, if it was covered in the New York Times, the notion of the national media exposing this somehow moved local officials to at least get into the legal process. The second factor, which reduces the likelihood of anything's going to happen, is if the narrative or the allegation suggests local police involvement. If they're alleging the sheriff or a deputy did something, generally no action. That's what we found to this point in our initial study. And it brings to mind a line from the movie Mississippi Burning. If a sheriff in a town like this says that's what happened, that's what happened. I show some of those just to point out that you look at these retrospectively and they're right out of central casting. So that was one project. The other two projects I'll draw upon a little bit here come from the work I've done with Barbara Palmer on women in congressional elections. The second is from my own project where I'm looking at, historically, elections to the U.S. House of Representatives from the South. And what I want to get into here, essentially, are things political scientists look at so we begin to grasp the change that has occurred in the wake of the civil rights movement. Okay? The first of the legacies, it's important to understand that there were three movements going on that were entwined. There is a 1946 case from California, Mendez, that attacked segregation in California schools that was a forerunner of Brown. Latinos were brought under the protection of the Voting Rights Act in the 1970s. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had sex inserted in there, so you could not discriminate in employment on the basis of sex. So essentially it's important to understand how these three movements were entwined as time unfolded. Now this is the kind of stuff political scientists look at. Okay, first is party identification among African Americans. And what you can see, you'll see the inflection point, the big change, an average of 58% Democrat coming into the 60s, and then the jump. Okay? And we find a similar pattern with voting. Okay? African American support of Democratic presidential candidates jumps here, and it fluctuates between 80 and 90% across time. One of the most solid, the most solid voting bloc. And I have a little bit of fun with this one with my students to say, well, blacks just voted for Obama because he's black. Well, look at 2004 and 2000. Last time I checked, Al Gore and John Kerry were pretty white. So essentially that is a product of an historical pattern. The other pattern to note, the election of Lyndon Johnson in 1964 is the last time a Democratic candidate won a majority of the white vote nationally. Now we could look at representation in the U.S. House of Representatives. And again, you could see the long-term consequences of that movement politics in the sense that you see a rise in the number of women, the number of African Americans, and the number of Hispanics elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Okay? This combines them just to show you, in 1956, less than 4% of the 435 members of the House were black, Latino, or female. Today that number is over 25%, roughly about 27% there. So again, a long-term consequence of changes that flowed out of the anniversaries we'll be commemorating. Now, there has also been a transformation in Southern politics. If you look at that, that's party ID among white Southerners. Okay. So in 1952, Democrats enjoyed a 71-point advantage. Okay. Now, over time, that's declined to the point in 2008, when the last national election study was conducted, Republicans had a 17-point advantage over Democrats among white Southerners. So these changes also transform the character of Southern politics. Now, if we look at proportion of white Southerners voting Democrat, the light blue line is for the United States House of Representatives. The bottom line is for president. And this is kind of fascinating. Essentially, most of the research in political science talks about top-down change. That is, movement away from the Democrat Party began at the presidential level, then at the statewide level, governor, senators, then at the level of the U.S. House of Representatives, and other work shows now at the level of the state legislatures. A lot of split ticket voting here, not very much here. Okay? Again, a substantial change. This is the proportion of Southern seats in the U.S. House won by Republicans. And I use as a definition in the South, the convention won 11 states of the former Confederacy. But that has changed over time from roughly 2% of all Southern seats to, after the 2010 election, 71% of Southern seats in the U.S. House are held by members of the Republican Party. Okay. Now, there are a couple changes within that if you think over time. Number one, over time, the South has more seats in the House of Representatives. The gains in population in Florida, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina bring in more seats. Second, the Northeastern and in part Midwestern moderate Republicans have been defeated in a lot of recent elections, such that then the center of gravity in the party is moving southward. And these are products of both demography and of divisions coming out of the civil rights era. Now we can get and talk a little bit about the messages we pick up. And fascinating. The Gretz is shown in the upper left. He was a Lutheran minister during the bus boycott. He was a participant. The houses were bombed. Coach Huggins faced off Sheriff Clark during the Teachers' March in Selma. The Montgomerys, Velda and Vera, lived 3 doors down from Dr. King. Their father coordinated rides during the bus boycott. The family took in and hid the Freedom Riders when they were beat up in Montgomery, and they were participants in the '65 March. Jewel McDonald, okay, Neshoba County, Philadelphia, Mississippi. Her mother was beat up after a church meeting by the Klan. Later that night, the church was burned. Joanne Bland of Selma was beat up on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And Elaine Turner of Memphis holds the record for most times arrested in civil rights activity. Those are the kinds of people our students get to meet and talk to. And their message, moving, please tell our stories. There is the fear that those memories and those stories are going to go away. And I'll point out Minnie Jean Brown, who we met 2 years ago. One of the Little Rock Nine, the one expelled. And when she was talking to us, she mentioned what struck her the most were the number of women in that mob screaming at them. And as she reflected to our students, and she said, you got to know how to turn it around. Because that day, they threw away their dignity and it landed on us. We've heard that a number of times. Whoever listens to a witness becomes a witness. There we are with Fred Gray, who was the attorney during the boycott. The Harrison Gretz family, Joanne Bland, the Gretz family last year, and lo and behold, there's Julian Bond who showed up. Now, a second message is don't ignore this history. And what I'm going to point out here is that the fact of the matter is this history has become a matter of partisan dispute. Okay. Whether or not it's taught and how it is taught. Now, I'm going to use an example from Texas. Texas requires that textbooks report the proportion of Democrats and Republicans voting for these landmark bills, the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act. Now, what you see there is more Democrats proportionately than Republicans. That's true, absolutely true, but somewhat misleading. What if we control by region? In other words, regional differences are much more powerful in explaining the vote than simply party. And we all were brought up, of my generation in grad school, of a three-party system in Congress: Republicans, Northern and Southern Democrats. Now, when you combine party and region, you get those results. Now, what this tells us is that those two acts, as well, I've looked at 57, 60, 68, were passed by bipartisan coalitions of Northern Democrats and Republicans. Okay. But essentially, taking you through what we call three control variables doesn't work in our 15-second soundbite era. And our students tell us this all the time. Now, a few examples from contemporary politics. Lee Atwater took the Southern strategy to a new level. There's his quotes. And most famously in the election of 1988, those were Atwater's quotes. And most people who study national elections recall the Willie Horton ad as being controversial. These are things sent to me by people that I've met along the way in the pilgrimage. A recent quote here, 2010. My point in showing the table in these quotes is not a partisan one. It goes back to the title of the manuscript I'm working on, The Great Contradiction. And part of that great contradiction is that the issues of slavery, Reconstruction, civil rights, and race historically have blown up three-party systems. They blew up the Whigs and the Jacksonians, leading the Civil War. It blew up the Reconstruction era system, and it blew up essentially the New Deal system. And it's to point out that race as an issue remains something we continue to struggle with politically in our contemporary times. I'm going to introduce you next to two pilgrims to finish off. I've gone my time, and I've learned after a number of years here that sometimes it's best to stand aside and listen to what students have to say. You're going to meet Krista Brown and Danielle Volpe.
My name is Krista Brown. I am a senior dance performance major with a minor in human rights. There's this statue at Ole Miss of James Meredith, and it stands a little taller than me, and his face looks so friendly, and he's about to walk into the eye of an angry mob. Or he would have been had he been alive. He has 1 foot forward, 1 foot behind, the stance of one who's marched through historic times, but he left a hand out for me, the finger splayed slightly, saying, "Come on, Krista, grab my hand and we'll face hate together." But his hands, his small in stature hands, were frozen in stone, frozen in a time in which mine could not quite fit. So I grabbed his arm, we took a picture, and he stayed behind because I had to move on. There were other hands to hold, or attempt to hold, but these attempts at connection were failed attempts at connection because their hands were so distant from me. They were blocked by ashes, blocked by dust, blocked by pain and misery, blocked by caskets, blocked by water, blocked by ignorance, or like Viola's, blocked by bars. And I came close to touching her, but my shoulder got in the way, so all I could do was reach and thank and pray. And there were hands wiping tears, hands holding signs, hands raising fists, hands pointed in defiance, and my hands, my 2010 hands, were just too short to reach through the hallways of history and hold on to their hands, their strong, beautiful, beaten and blood-stained hands. So what then do I do now? As the past is a printed and unknown history, and the future a not-so-present mystery, and my hands, my modern-day hands, are too young to join to their hands, thusly limited to my neighbor's hands, and in a world of isolation and internet notification, who might my neighbor be? The poor, the rich, the far, the near, the helpless, the helpful, the hated, the revered, friends, enemies, look, see. My neighbor is you, and your neighbor, me. For red and yellow, black and white, we are precious in his sight, and I will hold your hand tonight because we're marching the same way. And with my hand, crossing to cling to your hand, your beautiful, strong 21st century hand, and our feet dancing to our modern drum, we march because we have to, for we will and we shall overcome.
A brief story associated with Danielle Volpe. One year, her husband was studying at Perkins. He was an intern in the chaplain's office. He went on the pilgrimage, and Danielle stayed back to take care of their 2 young children. Then the next year, they reversed roles, and Danielle went with us. And this is sort of Danielle's memoir.
My name is Danielle Volpe. I'm 33 years old, and I've never been exposed to so much hatred, violence, and atrocities against men, women, young children as I was at the Civil Rights Pilgrimage. I admired Rosa Parks' courage because I am a woman. I cried when the house of Pastor Robert Griot was bombed because I am a pastor's wife. I cried when I heard what happened to Emmett Till because I am a mother. I rejoiced. When I heard brilliant lawyers winning the judicial civil rights battle because I am a lawyer. I am a woman, a pastor's wife, a mother, and a lawyer. And this experience will shape my life forever.
So that kind of gives you an indicator of what I meant by the interaction between intellect or reason and emotion. And I would use the Bones versus Spock analogy, but nobody understands that anymore. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's a busy Monday. You all coming out to hear the talk. I appreciate it.